As she struggled to put on her coat, having collected her purse as well as a small shopping bag, a discernible sigh could be heard from her. Her workday was done, but that really wasn't the reason for her sigh, as I soon learned. I walked up to her and I said, "What's up, Effie?" She's a nearly 80-year-old woman at the time, and she worked at the store which I managed. She fixed her gaze on me and said, "Well, when I was young, my father would always be there for me. When I was scared or when I was troubled, he made me feel safe." It was at that moment that I remembered there had been a number of reports in the area of older women being assaulted, and she would be riding the bus back home alone, which in her case was a small apartment located close to the water's edge in Long Beach. She was all alone in the world, so vulnerable, and my heart went out to her. I said, "Effie, I'll be happy to drive you home and make sure you get into your apartment safe and secure." And her response was predictable and just as I expected. "I don't want to put you out," she said. "You have a new baby and your wife is home alone. Plus it's so out of your way. I'll be all right." It really didn't take too much persuading before she accepted my offer, and for the next several days I drove her home following work. Now, the memory of that event nearly 5 decades after the fact came to mind recently when I read a brief story about a young woman who was greatly concerned about walking home from work late one night. There had been a male customer who was acting kind of strangely, and she was feeling frightened and vulnerable and alone and quite helpless. She stayed inside the restaurant and locked the door as she was the key holder. Once she had locked herself in, she immediately picked up the phone and made a phone call. Within a very few minutes after answering the phone, her father was knocking at the door to let her know he had arrived and was there to see to it that she got home safe and sound. There had been absolutely no hesitation on the part of her father. He got the call. He responded immediately. What a blessedness there is to have such certainty. In the 46th Psalm, that level of assurance is on display. As David, the author, writes, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea." That's in the first 2 verses of that psalm. Now notice what's found also in the first 2 verses of the 91st Psalm. "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust." In our Heavenly Father, we find shelter and total security. The ravages of the world need not concern us because we have that trust, we have that confidence. In fact, throughout the book of Psalms, as David writes in so many of the Psalms, he returns frequently to the theme of finding comfort in the God of heaven. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold," is what he writes in the 18th Psalm in verse 2. I would encourage you to take some time to look up and consider as well what can be seen in Psalms 27 verse 5 and the 55th Psalm in verse 8. Now, not to be outdone, David's son Solomon writes the following as seen in Proverbs, the 14th chapter and verse 26. "In the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence." Whereas in the 18th chapter of Proverbs And verse 10, Solomon notes, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runs into it and is safe. Isn't that what we want? Safety, security, to be secure and safe. As did that older woman, Effie Millwood, who worked in the store that I managed 5 decades ago. That's what she wanted. The young woman in the story that triggered all those thoughts of Effie. That's what she wanted. The security and safety. And that's what mankind wants even today, is that security and safety. And the world is longing for a place of comfort, a place of security. That's right before their eyes. If only they would take the time to look and see. James, in the 4th chapter of his epistle, writes of the necessity to draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. How blessed that is. But James goes on to say, cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. The celebration of victory for those who have fully turned to God and obeys his directives is fully explained by Paul in the 8th chapter of the book of Romans. And I want to focus on 2 instances therein. Verse 26, and then through the end of the chapter, you really begin to see those things. But where I want to focus is where Paul writes, what shall we say to these things? And he was talking about all the things that are out there that cause us great vexation and fear, has us longing for security and safety. But then Paul ultimately gets to this point where he says in verse 31, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? That 80-year-old woman realized her father was always there. Now she felt alone and vulnerable. The young woman realized that a phone call away was her father, and he was there for her. Do you realize our Father is there for us? And he is just a call away. And that's what David was celebrating throughout the book of Psalms, looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. The beautiful part about it is the Messiah has come. We have been the ones who benefited from his shed blood if we have followed the directives that God has put in place. We can find safety and security, but we can only find it in a loving, caring relationship with God. And the only way to do that is by going through Christ, who is our access to the Father, and by following exactly what he has put in place. So I encourage you, if you want security, you want safety, look to the God of heaven, and therein you will be satisfied.